Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Jeremy, founder of QuickMail.io.
And this is Jack from Emails That Sell.
All right, today we're going to talk about how to apply cold email to accelerate the growth of a small business. And the business we're going to talk about is the one of a really good friend. I've seen his business growing in the last 3 years, and Jack and I have been thinking about how we could use cold email if we were in his shoes to accelerate his growth. So if you're a solo founder or client-founded business, for that matters, this guy's definitely for you. But if you're not, you still want to stick around because we're going to cover a lot of things, really, that could be applicable no matter what business you're in. For example, we'll be covering untraditional applications of cold email to help you gather testimonials, convert inbound leads, and re-engage past customers. And if you stick around until the end, you'll know everything about how to reduce the chances of failure before sending your first cold email campaign. Today we're going to talk about Txt2Give. This is a startup that is in a donation space. So basically, to give you some background, Txt2Give is run by a solo founder. He created the company like 4 years ago. He's got lots of customers already, like close to 1,000. But the growth is not as fast as he'd like. And the question is, what would we do if we were hired tomorrow to work for him? Or what could he be doing to harness the power of cold email?
Obviously you can take a look at some of the industries that Txt2Give is serving and just go ahead and write up some cold emails and fire them off to all of the people in charge of donations across many different industries. But the approach Jeremy and I are going to take is quite a bit more calculated so that hopefully it will bring in a lot more results with the fewest emails sent. So we won't have to do a massive send in order to get some real customers coming in a way that's repeatable and that helps Txt2Give keep growing as the months go on.
Jack's probably be calculated. I won't. I'll be like totally organic kind of guy.
Taking a look at some of the customers that this startup has on their website, I see that 95% of them are churches. So even though it says they serve churches, nonprofits, schools, and universities on their website, I don't want to focus on anyone other than churches because it's so clear that this is the space they're having the most traction with. Okay, so with that said, Jeremy, how do we get more churches to bring on Txt2Give?
As a solo entrepreneur, one of the biggest challenge is we got a lot of caps. We need to do marketing, we need to do sales, we need to do development sometimes, we need to do lots of different areas. And obviously, when it comes to try a new thing like cold email, then the game here is focus. So you can't go ahead, you don't have the power that Unbounce had in your previous cast where they have like massive teams and they could go after lots of things. As a solo entrepreneur, you're going to have to be extremely focused on to doing one thing. So Jack nailed it, from the start is let's focus purely on the church rather than trying to diversify and try to make sure that this channel works in a sort of semi-automated way. And once this is like used as a good foundation and a good funnel, then we could move on to a different industry or maybe a different geographical market.
I think it's important to point out here that we're trying to remove as much risk as possible with this cold email campaign because there's so many variables that go into a successful campaign or a failed campaign, such as did you reach out to the right people? Did you say the right thing in your email? Did you have the right offer? And so on. Now, if we can just remove at least one variable, which would be, is this segment interested and willing to buy what I have to sell? We've nailed down that churches have been a profitable segment to go after. So we're just going to focus on them first. Now it's just our job to put together the right kind of emails and make sure that we're reaching out to the right kinds of people at those organizations.
Obviously, prospecting could be time-consuming for, like I said, someone that don't want to spread himself in. So what would be a good advice for a solo founder in that position to go ahead and then have a sort of like prospecting on automation kind of thing?
Starting with the existing customers that you already have is a great place to begin this prospecting effort. And it should help take a lot of guesswork and also save a lot of time when it comes to building your list for this campaign.
Try to re-engage older leads people who didn't reply last year, maybe this year is more suitable. A lot of time, the success of cold email is time-based, like you hit them at the right moment where they were thinking about that. And every year makes the technology gap smaller. So maybe more people are considering into 2018. So I would definitely recontact my older list from 2017 and then reuse them as well.
I think that's a great point, Jeremy. I have another idea when it comes to a way to save time with list building, but also get some good results in the door. It's talking about our VIP list here. So what are the few people that we can contact that can potentially bring us dozens of customers each if we can just establish the right relationship with these influencers within the, let's say, church space? For example, there's quite a few conferences that has this audience in front of them already. If the founder of Txt2Give could simply identify a few good conferences that they would be able to speak at, send a couple cold emails to those conference organizers and get some speeches together, potentially that's a very practical way to get in front of thousands of their potential customers at one time.
Another great way is to figure out who is playing in the same space as you, as another software who already unlocked a part of the market, and try to piggyback on them. So you basically give them a cut of your revenue if they manage to bring you some clients. Maybe they provide a certain services to churches, and having also your own services on top of it may actually make the offer more interesting.
Another way that you could benefit from the fact that there's a lot of technologies being used in this market is, let's say you could build a separate list of churches that, let's say, are using PayPal donations to collect money on their website. So you wouldn't necessarily have to strike a partnership between Txt2Give and PayPal, but instead you could just use PayPal to help you identify churches that are currently accepting donations in a possibly outdated way that Txt2Give can provide a new and better tool for collecting donations.
Yeah, that's very smart. So you'll be looking like things like BuiltWith or Nerdy Data as well.
Nerdy Data will tell you which websites, let's say, are using PayPal or Stripe to collect donations, if you can get the right snippet that you want to search for. BuiltWith is also a good tool, but also LinkedIn Sales Navigator will let you filter in many ways. So like you can go into Sales Navigator, look for accounts, filter by, industry as religious institutions. Maybe the keyword would be church. You could filter it a little bit further depending on the best company size to go after. And you can get that answer by your customer roster. So just taking a look at the churches using Txt2Give, seeing how big they are on LinkedIn, and then you'll know who to filter out.
Find everything great. It's just like I don't have time, or I don't like doing all those things that we're suggesting, which is quite common actually to solo founders. Usually they're really good at one thing, be it sales, be it development, being marketing. And it's not always common that they also like to do all the prospecting thing, which could be quite tedious, to some extent. What advice would you give to that person who really, have to drag their feet to do the sort of thing because honestly, deep down, they just don't want to do it?
Option one would be hire out an agency who could do this from start to finish. You don't have to think about it, and they'll handle everything for you. Another option would be to hire somebody to fill a particular role of the prospecting that you do not like. So maybe a virtual assistant can help you out with identifying these churches that are using PayPal, for instance, to collect donations. What might not be a bad approach is if you're pressed for time, but wanted to make sure that this outreach effort was done properly, you could do, let's say, send 100 emails yourself. Just find 100 prospects yourself, write maybe 3 emails, and just gauge to see if you're remotely getting some replies of interest in your inbox. And if so, that's sort of a really quick way to validate that this outbound thing might work, especially if it was done with a little bit more research and depth.
Okay, I'm going to hire someone. One of my hesitation would be, how am I going to judge the success of a campaign? Is that like a realistic expectation? Can I go with any price point I have? At what point does that make sense? And how am I going to judge a success?
So I think it would be important for Txt2Give to take a look at what happens in their sales process once they get a lead in the door. how many touch points does it usually take for them to sell to a new customer?
Ooh,
and
love it.
how much time does it take Txt2Give to handle that sales process? And finally, at what price point are they bringing on new customers? So we may learn, Jeremy, that Txt2Give is not charging enough in order to justify a one-to-one sales process that takes 10 hours on their, let's say employees side. And if that's the case, then maybe an outbound campaign that requires a lot of touches and personal demo might not be the best growth channel for them. But if they could take a look at their historical sales process and maybe they realize that all it really takes is a couple back and forth messages if the lead is interested, and typically they'll sign up on their own, then they've got a much better idea if this is going to be a success or not. And of course, what do you call a successful campaign just comes down to the amount of time and money invested in the campaign compared to the return on investment, of course. So, I think it's kind of a numbers game here where you just figure out how much time and money goes into the campaign and making sure that you get enough out of it after reaching out to your first batch of prospects.
You sort of say it doesn't matter if they're successful or not as long as the economics work. And once the economic works, you could always try multiple different agencies to figure out, is this one getting better results or not? But as long as you're profitable overall, then that works.
Yeah, and if you're doing it on your own, keep in mind that you're going to be A/B testing your messages. So if you can break even on your first, let's say, couple weeks, there's a very strong chance that you're only going to go up from there because you'll be learning so much from each new set of emails that you send out that it's almost guaranteed that the second month of your campaign is going to be more profitable, more successful than your first.
How long should I invest to figure out is that going to work or not?
You should be able to justify your cold email campaign after 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, your list should have already seen, let's say, maybe 3 to 6 emails from you, and that'll give you a good pulse on, is your campaign working? Are you getting interested leads in the door? And finally, are those interested leads closing? And those answers are going to help you determine if you should continue, if you should scale up and send to a larger list next week, or if you need to take a pause and radically change your email content so that you can try a new angle.
If cold email is not really your thing, one other approach would be to simply combine it with existing activities. So if, for example, you like going to conferences, just make it a habit to try to contact people before going to the conferences and after going to the conferences as well with cold email. So it's basically mixing what you're already doing with just, adding a bit of cold email element, which could then be outsourced to your VAs. Like, hey, here's the people that are going to this conference. Please contact them on my behalf. Here's roughly the thing I want to tell. And that actually makes me think that we haven't really talked about how should I approach the message in this situation.
For crafting the messages, it starts with the way you built your list. Let's go back to what we talked about, Jeremy, when we said, okay, maybe we'll identify churches in the US that have at least 50 employees and that use PayPal donations. Then that's where we start the conversation. So maybe just calling out that you learned recently that they're using PayPal to collect donations, and you've got maybe a case study that shows by switching to Txt2Give over PayPal, you might be able to increase donations by 10%. My thinking on this approach is first identify why you're reaching out to these people. Next, we're going to step in the prospect's shoes and figure out what would get them most excited about Txt2Give. And from the quick research that I did on the startup, it seems like generating more donation funds is a clear benefit to using Txt2Give. So I'm going to include that one benefit in this first email and back it up with a case study. So mentioning that this particular church that switched from PayPal to Txt2Give was able to increase donations by 10% would be a strong initial cold email that I would like to see tested.
In your experience, Jack, what's been proven to work really well? Like stats, case studies, just informal sort of question, like hey type of thing.
The best case study that you can use in a cold email is one that is very similar to the company that you're reaching out to. So if you can mention that another church used this to generate more donations, that's great. Even better, if you can mention that a similar church with about the same number of members use this to increase donations, even better. Take it a step further. If you can say a similar church that has about the same number of members and employees also in the Dallas area, and then they might even recognize the church that you're talking about. And if that's the case, then it's going to be really hard to ignore that email.
Ooh, I got a great idea. How about like a two-part campaign? So first, you actually contact your existing customers and you say, hey, by the way, just doing some research, it's been a year you're with us. How much difference have you seen on your donation?
Right.
And if people reply like a good thing, then you apply your strategy, which is, okay, those guys say 30%. Who is in neighborhood is also, fitting those same criteria, and then going and contacting them and say, hey, by the way, here's what I just received today. Maybe it's 2018. Maybe it's worth giving it a go. What do you think?
Yeah, that's great. And I think using cold email to generate case studies is smart, and it'll work, and it'll help you manage that whole case study testimonial gathering project fairly easily. Just keep in mind, this example that I'm giving is under the assumption that your customer, your client is okay with you using their case study and that they've provided a real stat that you can throw in there to just make a very concrete example of how Txt2Give helps churches.
One other idea I had as well is we were talking about combining it with existing activities you're doing, like, going to conferences and so on. But you could also combine it with a few things that already work. So for example, is Facebook ads is working, then actually try to add a cold email component to your Facebook ad in order to verify is that converting even better in your funnel. That could be like your small tripwires, like, hey, I noticed that you registered to XYZ list based on the Facebook ad. Here is some free piece of information for you, or some extra thing for you, and providing value that way through sort of like cold email indirectly.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is just because it's not, let's say, a traditional cold email in that you've just maybe found their email on the web and they have no relationship with your company, it doesn't mean that you can't use quote unquote cold email to get a conversation going. Even let's say they're an old customer of yours, they've churned maybe 6 months ago. If you've just come out with a new feature that maybe they requested, or maybe you think it might get them back on board with your product, it doesn't mean that you can't use this kind of outreach to add another customer to your roster.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, when Jack and I are talking about cold email, most of the time is like non-solicited email, but it doesn't mean that they have no sort of relationship with you per se. What I mean by that is that it's not okay to send a MailChimp automation, but it needs to come from a sales automation standpoint. So it needs to come from your inbox, like if you're really reacting to them and sending them an email personally. So it's not marketing automation, it's sales automation where we really see cold email and all its application.
There's quite a few churches that you can contact, and there's a lot of people at each church that you can track down an email address for. But in the beginning, and especially in the beginning, you're going to want to go for some lower hanging fruit here. So I have a hypothesis that you'd be much more successful reaching out to people within each organization that their day-to-day job revolves around collecting donations. That kind of person will be much more willing to get back to you than, let's say, the head of the church or a pastor or a teacher or one of the musicians that they hire every weekend. It's, so it's just getting deliberate with who you add on your list, and then tying that conversation back to how you can help them achieve whatever it is that they're looking to do.
Hey, what about using event-based things? Like at the moment, it's the beginning of the year. Maybe people are setting goals, resolution, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And basically, using that in order to elicit some sort of motivation to try out new things or attempt a new product.
I think that's smart, absolutely. And for Txt2Give, if they're starting conversations with churches, they may find that the holiday season, they see quite a lot of donations come in the door, but maybe a couple months later, things slow down. Maybe that's the best time to start this campaign based around, quote unquote, the slow season.
Oh, good question. Would you actually start it before to figure out what is the current interest? And then when the good season hits, then you can go full speed on that?
I would send a few emails to just find out how the calendar works and if there's any weeks to avoid or weeks to ramp things up. But I wouldn't try and send a lot of emails to my list. It would just strictly be for information gathering, and then I would write up a campaign when that time of the year comes to get that conversation going.
I think I'm done with all my points. Do you have more points, Jack, you want to talk about?
Let's talk about email content before we wrap up this episode. There's a lot of things that Txt2Give would probably want to include in their email campaign, and it doesn't have to do with just helping churches raise about 10% more donation money. Instead, they can write an email that talks about how much time is saved using Txt2Give over other platforms that are just not as simple to use. They can talk about how happy the church members are that get to use Txt2Give at their churches because it's just a much more easy process and it helps them give back to their church in a way that doesn't require a headache or filling out forms. So just talking about member satisfaction, just like church members love to use Txt2Give, and maybe that's a good place to drop a testimonial in. The idea here is just figuring out what would be a value proposition or a selling point for the person that has ended up on our list, and just making sure we're including those selling points in our campaign across several different emails, highlighting just one selling point at a time. Here's like a good concrete example. So on Txt2Give.co, here's 6 value propositions on their website they've given space on their homepage to talk about. The first one is it's simple and it's easy to use. The next one is it's affordable, so they can get Txt2Give for as low as $25 a month. Another one, it's secure. Fourth, it's multilingual. Fifth, it integrates with all of the platforms and church management software they're using. And finally, there's no contract. So each one of those benefits on their homepage would make a great topic for a cold email to send out. All right, so in this episode, we talked about how there's a lot of different ways that you can accelerate your growth using cold emails. Even if you've got a lot of things on your plate or cold email isn't your specialty, there's ways to make it work for your business. Next, we talked about the fact that even though you've already contacted a prospect or they started the conversation, maybe through inbound, you can still rely on cold email strategies to maximize that channel's effectiveness. Finally, if you're going to use a case study in your cold emails, find similar organizations that you can share it with that will identify with the case study the most so that you can get the best results. Hey, cold emailer.
Yeah, you.
If you got some value from this episode, give us a high five by sharing a 2-sentence review on iTunes.
Or Stitcher or Tuning, that works too.
It's a quick way to help other growth-minded folks like us find this podcast
so they can send awesome emails
and make everyone's inbox a better place. Thanks.